So welcome along to the Storming Waters podcast or videocast or stream or whatever you want to call it. A bit of a general welcome. I'm Ben, and that's Dave sitting there above me in our respective separate and socially distanced locations. And you might be wondering why we're sitting here, and we might be wondering that too. But a few weeks ago, and before the current lockdown restrictions, and before we sort of knew how serious this second wave was necessarily going to be, particularly for us, that we thought that something along this kind of conversational format, very informal, might be useful. I personally thought it might be something useful for me as somebody who came back to God 2 or 3 months ago now, probably having a meaningful Christian faith for the first time in my life, certainly my adult life, and having certain questions in my own mind, not necessarily questions that would make me doubt my faith or something, but questions that any inquiring person or inquiring mind might have, and it's good to ask those questions and not sit with them to yourself too long, but get some perspective from somebody who might have been around in the faith a bit longer, and that's, for me, that's my dad, who's sitting there, and obviously the main thing in anyone's mind at the moment, and probably the thing that kind of sped up my own thinking in terms of my Christian faith and my return to God, is the big C word of coronavirus or COVID-19, and that is. Let's pause there a minute and I can come back to that, but why don't I let my dad, so I'm Ben Roberts, and that's my dad, Dave Roberts, sitting up there, and I'll let him give a bit of background about himself now.
Hello everybody, I'm Ben's dad. My background geographically for a long time has been Eastbourne, and I'm a local church pastor there. But some of you who are watching this may have been aware of me as somebody who was a magazine editor back in the day, Christianity and Renewal, and one of the founders of Youth Work. I've been very involved in large-scale conferences to do worship, children's ministry. And in the more recent decades, I've been helping people write books about prayer, Grace Outpouring, and the 24/7 prayer book, Red Moon Rising. In the background to all of that, I've been very interested in the interface between Christianity and medical care, and how over the decades, centuries, millennia really, Christians have been instrumental in establishing healthcare in many, many nations. Because of my interest in that area, I was very aware from January the 1st of 2020, when the West became aware of what was then called the Wuhan pneumonia, that this was a challenging thing, and it might be the pandemic that everybody had talked about would come one day, that didn't peter out like the H1N1, or the 1957 one, or the 1968 influenza one, but actually had a worldwide impact. And so I have a particular interest in this one and this subject because of my own study over the last 10 or 15 years into the nature of infection, disease, and how Christians have responded to that throughout the world over the last several hundred years. So I come to this discussion with some of that in the background.
Thanks, Dad. So obviously we're not kind of medical experts, and we're not going to sit here and go through a blow-by-blow account of COVID-19. We're more looking, I suppose, in terms of a practical theological point of view. So, you know, what does it mean for us, and how should we respond to it, and how should we behave as Christians, or people that are curious about the Christian faith, and this whole last 9 months and the sort of 9 months coming up might be causing them to ask some questions, because this really is, you know, one of the, for most of us that are alive now, the biggest societal thing that we've had to deal with, and it's sort of crises within a crisis, because it's not just the immediate medical crisis of people getting sick and some people dying, but it's the knock-on effects of that. It's the job losses, perhaps just the fear of infection, or the lockdowns causing people to be lonely or isolated, or losing jobs and so on, and then the other things that are contained within that. So things like the governmental responses. The day that we're recording this, which is probably a few days before you'll see it, is the day after the American elections. And again, that's not something where we might go through a blow-by-blow account, state by state, or anything like that, but just asking each other and ourselves, you know, what does Christian governance look like? Does such a thing as Christian governance exist? So, yeah, really the biggest challenge that we as a nation, or a group of nations, the world has seen for over 70 years. So we're just going to informally chat about those things today, and then probably try and do this maybe once a week, see how we can make sense of it in our own heads, and what sort of things that should spur us on to do. How can we as individuals and groups of people, and nations and churches and communities help each other and other people to be resilient, and sort of get through this, and make some sense of it in our own heads, as well as you know, in groups of people, in families, in our streets and communities. But today, I think we're going to talk about sort of the main thing, the main reason why we're doing this, which is the pandemic itself, and really try and get to the essence of that before we move on, perhaps in other weeks, to talk about some of the other things that come out of it. So stuff to do with jobs and elections and governance and so on. So I think firstly, just kind of get an overview of the situation right now. So there's probably I don't know, 4 or 5 main ways of people responding and looking at the current situation, at the pandemic. There might be some people who are looking at COVID-19 as some kind of end times, some kind of harbinger, some kind of sort of indication that the end is nigh, and that God has sent this to show us that. What do you reckon about that, Deb?
There's a couple of things. There was a massive plague around the ancient Near East in about AD 300, and many people regarded that as, you know, the apocalyptic book of Revelation, grey horse, pale rider, beginning of the end. And people have speculated throughout the last 2,000 years, in the light of the interpretations of certain parts of the book of Daniel, careful working out of epochs and eras, or even what will happen after 1947, when the state of Israel is re-established, and after 1917, when Balfour enables the state of Israel to begin. And so people add it all up, and they basically say it's as when I was about your age, I read a book that said it was going to happen in 1988. And so I'm very wary of endless speculation about a jigsaw of facts, half facts, not facts, and everything else, leading to conclusive kind of thoughts about when things will end. Revelation does talk about disease that ravishes the world, but there will be many other candidates for that. And I would want to be very aware of the other thing, as a local church pastor, is that you can often find in your congregation that there are people whose whole thought pattern, you know, if they've read a book series like Left Behind, their whole thought pattern, for those of you who don't know about Left Behind, it's a 13-part apocalyptic vision of how the world might end and when the Christians will be taken away and how they will cope with the secular authorities. It's an epic, best-selling piece of fiction. And perhaps we should put the emphasis on the word fiction because it goes far beyond what Scripture would say. And in the middle of it all, you say to yourself, in the book of Thessalonians, it said, no man knoweth the day or the hour. And for many of us, we can find ourselves or the people that are in our spiritual care obsessing about where a situation fits in to this plan, or exactly what is God trying to do, what is God trying to say. And what begins to get lost in it all is the life, the ministry, the work, the vision of Jesus. And it becomes all about where do we fit in to this end time scenario. And then it leads to a kind of, well, do you know, there's no point in doing all these things and expending 10 or 15, 20 years investing into a community because the Lord's coming back. Let's save their souls. And the challenge with let's save their souls is that the Bible seems to infer through out the entire book and the ministry of Jesus that salvation or reconnection, restoration of our relationship with Jesus leads to a healing and a restoration of the wholeness of who we are. And the constant talk about souls is based in Greek thought, not in Hebrew thought. In Hebrew thought, salvation means restoration of everything, the way that you think, the way your heart is, and the things that you do. The Bible says in the Lord's Prayer that we are to be praying, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And the problem with this apocalyptic speculation is it's very sort of, there's a kingdom up there and we're going there and, well, you know, tough luck, you guys. You shouldn't have sinned so much. And begins to miss out on the fact that we're called to bring the kingdom here. And so I'm just really wary of end time speculation and trying to fit the coronavirus into that, because the exercise has been tried many times by many people and it's always ended in tears. And part of me thinks, let's look at Jesus. Let's not look at slightly contentious timelines. And if you multiply Z by X and add in, you know, Daniel and the Babylon, and you end up with this date.
Yeah, it's not an algorithm where you can kind of think, okay, yeah, it's going to be 2021 in August or something like that. I think this might be a good time to come on to the second way that some people might look at it, and perhaps slightly related, but where they'd say, oh yeah, it's because we've been misbehaving so much. And usually it's not because we've been misbehaving, but those people over there have been misbehaving. I mean, does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two problems with is this a judgment from God? Three. Jesus says, judge not that you be not judged. And we're encouraged to follow Jesus, honor God, and to get on with it. And not be endlessly speculating about exactly where people are at in their spiritual walk. And so, you know, sometimes in Christian circles you hear people saying, you know, I think they're real Christians. And part of me recoils a little bit because I think, you know, it's really hard to say. People are often on a journey And, let's not be constantly macroscopically looking at them. Second thing is, Jesus is confronted at one point, and he says to the disciples, look, we all need to stop speculating about why the Tower of Siloam fell over. Because the way that people were thinking about it was, oh, somebody in that district must have done something wrong. What the God must have caused them. And then when he was healing people would say to him, so was it the mother or the father? Where did the sin that caused this to come from? And he really kind of begins to refute that and say no. And so you then come on to the third thing, which relates to the character of God. And there is this whole thing throughout the whole of Scripture about his loving kindness, his steadfast love. As you enter into the New Testament, it becomes louder. It's like God is love. And if you don't understand that love, then you're not understanding God. And that his accent is towards calling us from our rebellion towards wisdom. And the wisdom is the way that we might live in the light of who he is and the way that Jesus was. And so you then begin to say, all right, well, surely there is an outcome here, Dave. If people behave badly, well, I believe that there will be a time when people stand before God. Jesus seems to be inferring this in Matthew 25, and they're called to give account of themselves. And some of them are really affirmed because they've been good and gracious and they've helped the poor and everything else. And some of them are told, why did you turn a blind eye to the poor? This comes out in Jesus' parable of Lazarus and Dives, where the rich man's brothers need to know what they need to know. And Abraham says, well, you've got the law, and that law is all about how you help the poor and the destitute and all of those things. And this whole look after the orphan, look after the widow, look after the foreigner, 37 times that motif comes through in the Old Testament. And it isn't sort of, well, they're the undeserving poor, just let them rot. There was a complex set of systemic social reasons why they've ended up economically deprived. So let's help them get back on their feet. At one point, it actually says, give the foreigner money. So give the person that's been released from slavery money so they can establish themselves. And so you then move on to the contemporary history of the early church. And some of these social issues to do with sexuality were very rife in Rome. You have to ask yourself, does the New Testament talk a lot about specific judgments of specific communities because of poor lifestyle choices? Well, actually, the New Testament seems to infer that it's the ignoring of wisdom that leads to the destructive life patterns that cause the bad things to happen. And so if we look at coronavirus, you have to ask yourself, what might have brought that out of the hinterlands of China into the rest of the world? Well, multiple reasons, really. One, it's felt to be a bat-related virus, like in the film Contagion.
As far as we know, yeah, at the moment.
Thus far, it's suggested that. It might have come via pangolins, which are a kind of anteater, which it uses as a delicacy in a certain kind of medicine. But what all of this indicates is that there are things happening in our interaction with nature that are causing this to come about. So God is not looking down and going, I will smite thee, I don't like thee. He's seeing something about our lack of wisdom unfolding. And then when that thing gets out further in society, you face the stark choice that many are facing today about whether they take the precautions and wait for the vaccine, or, whether they set that aside. Many young...
Yeah, that's the third thing. I was just going to sort of ask you about that. So there's some people that are saying either A, it's not real at all, or it's real, but we shouldn't really try and do anything about it because it's too inconvenient. And if we do too much about it, then it'll ruin everything else, because the economy will collapse. So it's better if, I don't know, 250,000 people, well, 250,000 people in the States have died, but, 250,000 people here, they'd say, oh, 500,000. Well, it's worth it because, the airlines will keep going, and you'll still be able to get a Starbucks and a Pret and everything. So for those of us that are healthy, we should just get on with it. And it's a bit sad, but so be it.
Yeah, I mean, because it's a relatively young disease, some people are saying, well, a lot of these people that have died, they would have died anyway a year or two later. So be it. But what that ignores is that at least 10%, they believe, of people who get it, from the mildest to the most severe, but don't die, will have symptoms or a brokenness in their health for several months or the rest of their lives, and that there will be a lot of premature deaths at some point in the future. Another thing that happens is that the hospitals get crushed, and then people who are just sick with other stuff begin to die unnecessarily. And there seems to be a consensus as well, not just with religious people, but in other sectors of society, that it's unethical to take the herd immunity route, whereby hundreds of people die, many of them people who can't physically socially distance and aren't living in the suburbs and do have to use public transport. And so that the burden of the pain falls on certain groups of people who don't necessarily have the wherewithal to socially distance, travel in a car, all of those kind of things. And so there's massive issues of ethics and justice that underlie the decisions we take. Some of the commentators in the papers are saying that, that the economic crash will be far worse if the hospitals get overrun, the workplaces have to stop because of illness, not because of lockdowns, and all of those things. And the other thing for me is the early church was in a situation where most of the people were one harvest away from starvation, and that many of the church people were in the sort of the bottom 4/7 of the economic spectrum. So the ones that were kind of sort of in the middle there, they had a bit of spare money, and they helped maintain the everyday welfare of the early church people from the wealth that some of them had. And so the Christian kind of reaction, the way that we want to lean into these things is, how can we do basic, ordinary things that, for instance, here in this town in which we live, the number of people receiving meals that would normally have just gone to homeless people has gone up by 400% or 500%, because there are people on 0 hours contracts being made redundant, all of these.
Working in hotels, and the hotels aren't open, and so that sort of thing. Yeah, I guess that I think you're probably just moving on to this, but that kind of brings us to, after establishing some of the perhaps the negative ways of looking at it, to reflect or the ways that we might perceive as sort of bad perspectives to have on it, for us to look at and reflect on ways, well, what should we be doing? If it's not a judgment, if it's not the end of the world in the very literal sense of things, if it's not something we should ignore, what should we be doing?
Well, it's interesting that around the country, both religious and non-religious people have basically lifted their heads up, many of them, and said, what can we do to help others? There's an instinct. Now, some people are, I'm just going to stay away from everything, I just need to survive. Others are like, yeah, whatever. And many of those people would be your kind of lockdown breakers and so on. But there is a group of people who are like, what can we do? What can we do practically? And I believe that the impulse of the biblical pattern and church practice has been towards that. So very quickly, let's look at the biblical pattern. So the prodigal son has been away, wasted his dad's money, adversely affected the community because of that. He comes back, and his father doesn't just make him a servant, he brings him back into the core of the family. There's the thing that I mentioned earlier about the poor, the widow, the child, and the foreigner, which is this big motif in the Old Testament, and how we should be caring and looking after them. There's this whole biblical thing about the refugee. Jesus was a refugee after all, had to flee to Egypt with the family because of the genocide that was taking place from Herod. So there is this accent in the scripture towards helping those who are in need. So the prodigal son comes back, penniless, looked after. The widow of Nain's story, we think, oh, it's a big mourning party, everybody's crying. Jesus sees it, he sees with compassion, and you think, oh, he's just upset because the son's died. Well, actually, it's a bit deeper than that. She's the widow of Nain, so her son is an important part of the economic unit, which means that she can survive. Without the son, unless there's an extended family that are still alive, she is going to be extremely vulnerable financially. And so Jesus prays for the son comes back to life. But the subtext of that story is he helped put her back into a place of economic security. Matthew 25, we mentioned earlier, you clothed the naked, you fed the hungry, you gave water to the thirsty, you visited the prisoner. All of those kind of things speak to us of a faith that then results in another directedness, a compassion for others. And one of the challenges for the church in the West is that it's so highly individualistic and about our interior feelings that we sometimes sort of miss out on how exterior much of the expression of faith was with Jesus, and he commended to his disciples. And so the early church, they were looking, Jesus. They had a pot of 300 denarii or whatever to look after the poor as they travelled around.
Right.
The church looked after the poor. They fed those that were in their community and further afield. I think that's one of the reasons why they grew. They were seen to be a compassionate community. So yeah, I think, before you get down to the nitty-gritties of what can be done practically, you're always looking back to say, what's the bedrock principle? What's the wisdom of God? And Jesus said, wisdom is known by its fruits. And we're looking to see not a load of good deeds that we can do to make sure that God loves us, but actually a lot of things that we do because it's a reflection of what we believe God has said and done about us. He has had compassion on us. He has allowed us to be reconciled through Jesus. And in the life of Jesus has given us a pattern by which to live, which involves compassion for the marginalized, the poor, and some of the other things that we're about to touch on, even in this discussion.
So, a couple of those things, just before we get to sort of summarising some of the discussions that we've had, just to touch on a couple more. So you talked about the prodigal son and Matthew 25 and things like that. But there's particular groups of people who, if I got COVID-19, I'd probably be okay. I have a wife, I have a family, I have, pretty good health, and I'm in a sort of okay age category. It doesn't mean I'm immune to it or anything, but there's certain groups of people, whether it might be certain age groups or for whatever reason, certain ethnic groups, or racial groups, or sort of racialized groups, might be a better word there, and that could be a genetic thing, or because all of this is so new, or it could be that, well, just people from those groups, quite frankly, in a lot of areas are being affected more than other areas because of the nature of work in those areas, because they are generally more sort of working class or public facing jobs, and that's why people are being affected. But how do we what's the wisdom there? How do we look at that and think, well, how do we care for these people? You know, sometimes we are those people ourselves. You know, how do we find the appropriate way to reach out there?
Well, I think we're going to touch on that in a minute, but the actual physical hands-on, what can we do? But I think too that we also dig a bit deeper. So when you look in the Old Testament, there's this idea of Jubilee, and behind that was that if you had lost your land due to debt or whatever, that it would be given back to your family at a later date, so that you did not become dependent on somebody else, but you could create your own food and well-being through that.
So the idea being that, at least in theory, every 50 years, the land would return. So it was sort of so that's something to do with the 7 times 7, and then just whacking another year on top of it, basically. Is that right? And
then after 7 years, if somebody had been indebted to you had to let them go and give them some money to get started again.
Right.
And there's this whole thing about constantly returning people to the possibility of productivity that was under their own control, shall we say. Psalm 23, in the second line, it says, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And when you really sit with that line, I shall not want, it's about God's constant provision for food security. And so when you look through particular parts of the Old Testament, they're told to leave the gleanings at the side of the field and not to take all the fruit off the tree. And this was to enable the poor, the widow, the orphan, or the foreigner to find food supply. When the people went up to Jerusalem for the special festivals, they had to take extra provisions for those that might not be able to procure their own provisions. So I think one of the things that would be at the front of our minds today, in the midst of the pandemic, if the situation deteriorates and the infrastructure begins to get a bit flaky, but even before then, is how can we enable food security for the biggest group of people? Here in the UK, there's a thing called Make Lunch, which helps ensure that children are getting a good meal every day. And that's a thing, and there are many other things like it. That,
one of the most sort of admirable things I've seen in the last few weeks and months has been the whole, you know, this isn't to build up a particular person or individual, but the way that Marcus Rashford has kind of dealt with it by just getting really hands-on, you know, saying how we're going to feed these kids over the school holidays and over the summer, and how we're going to do it over Christmas. And, you know, the answers haven't been what everybody would have wanted. You know, some people might say, well, you know, but the fact that he's got companies to do it in the end because the government wouldn't has let the government off the hook. But the fact is, if he hadn't done that, in the short term, a lot of those kids wouldn't have eaten. So, you know, that's been something that where, you know, where I've seen somebody do something that you think, well, I don't know whether Marcus Rashford would call himself Christian or not, or is a Christian or not, but, you know, it looks like something that people like us should be doing. Yeah.
Well, when you look a bit further, you see that many of the food banks are coming from a faith community impetus in their area. And the Trestle Trust is all to do with Robert Trestle, who wrote a book called The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist back in the late 1800s.
Yeah,
to address
based on a place very near us, in part in Hastings, basically. Not that he, you know, called it Hastings, but yeah.
So there is this coming again and again. So Food Bank here in Eastbourne, just as a model, I'm sure people listening to this around the country, around the world, would know of a local model themselves. But we have a thing called the Matthew 25 project that have historically fed the homeless, but are now feeding a much bigger group. you then zero in on, in the book of Acts, Dorcas and Lydia were two ladies who were quite wealthy because of their entrepreneurial flair. And one of the things that they were noted for was their kindness. And then you come to Jeremiah 29, where it says, seek the prosperity of the place where you live. And then you look at the basic shalom principle that lies behind the word peace throughout the scripture, but especially in the New Testament. And when you look at the word shalom, it's about wholeness, healing, welfare, tranquility. And so in our orientation as believers towards obeying Jesus, we've got the Jubilee principle, we've got Psalm 23, food security, we've got shalom. The welfare thing plays into food security. Jeremiah 29, think about the place where you live. What would be good for it? What would be wonderful, merciful, compassionate for it? And then you've got these women like Dorcas and Lydia and some of the other people in the book of Acts account who are thinking about people's everyday needs as well as their needs for eternity, so to speak. Mm. So we then come to the areas and in our communities, and you think, who's helping the care home people? Well, quite often they're families, but this is an incredibly complex, but a place of death for many people. Who is helping people in the white working class areas or the BAME working class areas with their health needs, with their mental health needs, with their food security needs, and all of those kind of things? So one of the things we probably need to guard against is, as individuals, we cannot solve all of those problems. But as a group of people, we may find that the group can begin to facilitate things, often in concert with other people of goodwill, to alleviate those very problems.
Yeah,
and so
not saying that churches or Christians, they're the only ones doing it, or that they've got a monopoly on it. Sometimes it's Christians getting alongside other people who are already doing stuff, or sometimes it's the other people getting alongside the Christians, I guess.
Well, I mean, one of the advantages that the Christian community have got in the midst of all of that is that there are very few community groups in society with such large numbers who meet together so regularly and have such strong ties, as opposed to the sociological concept of weak ties.
We've got some buildings as well, which don't help all that much at the moment, but generally, even if it's just for storing stuff, it's helpful.
There's a big government paper about the potential pandemic in 2009, and it talked a lot about local authorities leaning on, in the right kind of way, gently, the communities of faith because of that very issue, the logistics of buildings. But also, they said in the paper that they have more skills to do with conflict resolution than many other societal groups. And so we're coming to this aware that a terrible thing is happening, all kinds of levels of why it might be happening. But what can we do as communities and as individuals, given this constant refrain throughout the scripture to look out for support and help mend and nurture people? That's our kind of bedrock that we come from. And I mean, if one of the other things that we've got in our little outline here for what we might talk about relates to what did the ancient church do? What are the patterns of history? So let me just give you one example. There was, in the plague in AD 3000-ish, the Christians had two things in their minds. One, Jesus was compassionate, we should do something. And the other was, it doesn't matter if we die, we're going to heaven. And so when a lot of people from other faith backgrounds either had a fatalistic worldview, oh, well, it's bound to happen, just need to get on with it, if we die, we die. And then other people had a sort of, in the classic sense of the word, pagan worldview, and they were like, let's get out of here as quick as can. Self-preservation is the order of the day. And it is said that the Christian communities who stayed put were then able to tend the people that were very sick, and that where they stayed put, 70% of the population survived. But in the other communities where people fled, large numbers of the population died because there was nobody with the will or the desire or the courage to help them. And so you then begin to see the emergence of the monasteries as places of medical care. And in certain parts of the world, the hospitals that they do have can be traced back to the activities from the last 300, 400 years, and in parts of the world much further back.
Yeah, and I suppose, you know, they were doing some really good stuff. It doesn't mean that everything that they did, you know, you could go back and say, well, you know, the Catholic laundries or what, you know, there was some pretty horrendous stuff, but the impetus was at least from some of the people the right one, even if at times it got distorted.
Yeah, and you know, part of the reason that AIDS spread, and it kind of illustrates why this is always, what are 5 reasons why this happened, was sleeping sickness injections, which use the same needle in some of the religious hospitals in Africa. So a failure of infection practice spread this disease far beyond where it might have otherwise gone.
Yeah.
But we do need to be wary. But the other side of the coin is, you know, when Boris was ill, what hospital was he in? St. Thomas. When people who are listening to this look around their local Christian community, they may well find, as we would in Eastbourne, that one of the hospitals was called St. Mary's and had a sort of loose association back in the day with the St. Mary's Parish Church. Another one was called All Saints, which related to another Anglican parish church. And there was a third one, which temporarily escapes me in memory terms, but there was 3 hospitals.
And Wilfrid's.
And St. Wilfrid's, which has now kind of taken on the mantle of palliative care. And so,
where our former Prime Minister was born, was it not?
Theresa May.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, wouldn't surprise me at all. So if we actually look at the fabric of the society that we live in today, and this is part of a much wider discussion, how much of it was framed by Christian witness from the 1800s through to the sort of 1940s, late 1940s, early 1950s. And we don't cite that to kind of big ourselves up. It's to say to ourselves as a community, why did we invest ourselves in that way? What was the direction of movement? Why was the church so involved in the fabric of a community's life? And what does that teach us for now? And so in responding to the coronavirus, if we take this end is nigh, I just need to preserve myself, you know, God's smiting them, I mustn't get in the way motif, it's not actually the biblical one.
No.
Because the biblical one is always compassion and looking beyond blame and judgment and saying, but so what can we do? I watched a very moving film in the World War II Museum in Dieppe, where British soldiers had been injured in the attack on Dieppe, and one of the nuns was treating the local people and the German soldiers who had been injured, and she went to the commander and she demanded that the hospital also treat the British soldiers. And then there was other stories of British soldiers rescuing drowning German soldiers and vice versa. And it was an incredibly poignant thing to see these practical acts of mercy in the middle of that conflict. And I think we have to look at ourselves and look at the situation. In Austria the other day, 3 of the people that came to the aid of the policeman that had been shot were people of migrant background. And their instinct was to save lives, not to score points or anything else. They viewed themselves as Austrians, and they viewed the policeman as a victim, and they went straight to his aid. And so we need to look beyond our sort of partisan way of viewing life and look for the instinct of Jesus. And the instinct of Jesus was often to heal those that nobody else wanted healed, or that other people took a dim view of. And so when we're walking into coronavirus situations, the question isn't, what did this lot do? It's, what can we do to help? What will help this person, from mental health issues all the way through to, do they need to get to the hospital now because of their respiratory issues? And it will involve a bit of risk sometimes, not foolhardy risk, not stupid risk. But if you were one of those early church guys bringing water to somebody with the plague, you were taking a risk. But the vast majority of the time, your risk paid off and they got better and you didn't get sick. So, you know, I think we have to think about all of those things. There's a rich heritage that we're standing in, biblically and historically, and it should galvanize us into action.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say what I take from that. It's, and this sort of goes a bit back to what we were saying right at the beginning, but that this isn't something that's new. There's been plagues before. There's been lots of them. So, you know, we shouldn't be like, oh, why is this happening now? This is the first time it's happened. You know, it must be something unique that you know is happening right now, because A, something we've done, or B, you know, this is it. Like, we've got 6 months left or something. But that, you know, as you say, we should be looking outward as much as we can. And obviously sometimes we are looking in and going, actually, I'm really not looking forward to the next 6 months. I'm really scared. And that's, you know, that's understandable. You know, there's nothing inherently wrong with feeling like that. But when we can, we should be looking out and saying, and not, you know, I suppose not in a way where we're thinking, oh, we've got to be the sort of big society or whatever, you know, David Cameron described it as, not in those terms where it's sort of like almost using churches or mosques or whatever to plug gaps, but actually to say, well, we should be going beyond that, and we always should be going beyond that. You know, there's things that government can do, but there's things that government will never be able to do because it's a government and it's not designed to do that, and it shouldn't be designed to do that. You know, the government's not going to have an army of sort of befrienders or, you know, people that are going to be able to, you know, be in somebody's life for 20 years or 20 months or 20 days or whatever, because it's always going to be much more of a kind of, well, how long do you need us for? Okay, brilliant, you're good now, we're off. And a church, hopefully, isn't going to be like that. You know, it shouldn't be like that. So
I think, I mean, you know, when I kind of encapsulate in my mind, I'm thinking that description of the shalom-oriented church, the peace of God type church that hangs on to those values to do with welfare and inclusion and so on. They're doing good intentionally because they believe in the wisdom of God. But what you've touched on there is, are we going to come in and do a quick fix, or are we going to be consistent in the lives of people? You know, so for instance, a lot of people have been highly isolated for the last 6 months, but some of them were quite isolated before that. And what they need is consistent, mundane friendship. You know, and there's a huge amount of literature out there. The Campaign to End Loneliness, I've just done a big report in the last day or two, which touches on some of this. And one of the reports I read said that a lot of the time people just need small group activity around a common interest. And that part of what will heal people of the depression, anxiety, and so on, that has arisen from the coronavirus is everyday friendship and inclusion, and drawing in a comfortable way into social activities and so on. And I often think about these things in terms of what I call the 1, 3, 12, and 70 principle. So there might be one person that people listening to this could really help. It might be the shopping, it might be the phone call during an isolation or lockdown time. It might be an invitation into what you might call a 12, a small group that's interested in gardens, or a small group that does knitting, or a small group that goes and watches the football down the pub.
Obviously, for the next month, you can't really go together and do those things, but there's ways of, for a lot of people, there's ways of kind of at least talking about those things, whether it be online or some kind of, telephone kind of circle or something, or, we've got to be creative, haven't we, at the moment, and think, well, actually, we can't do things the way that we did them a year ago, and hopefully in a year's time we might be able to do those things in the same way again, but perhaps we weren't doing them as well as we could have been doing them, and this might challenge us, as as dire as the situation is, and it's not something that we would, as humans, welcome. What is there's something I read recently, I think it was in a Pete Gregg book, How to Pray, but I think it was a quote from somebody else. I think he's called David Benning, but something like that anyway. And he said, and he wasn't talking about coronavirus at all, because the book was written a few years ago, but was saying, look, we shouldn't try and find some redemptive meaning in these awful situations, because that's well, at least that's not my theology, and I don't think it's your theology. We shouldn't be going, oh, God's doing it to teach us this, or he's doing it because that person was a Roman or whatever, but so the situations aren't blessings, but sometimes they contain a blessing. And I don't mean that in some kind of fortune cookie kind of way, but we probably wouldn't be having this conversation had it not happened, the coronavirus. Now, obviously, I'd rather it hadn't happened, which probably would have meant that there would have been some other route to us having this conversation, and in lots of ways that would have been better, because you don't want a global pandemic. I personally don't want to have to find my salvation through the death of millions of people. It just so happened that coronavirus kind of did give me some, this world historical event probably, at least in part, gave me some perspective on, well, hang on, like we're really kind of as much as we like to think these days, perhaps even they did 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago, or whatever, that we're sort of the masters of our own, that we've got it all mapped out, and we're on this great forward march to perfection and everything, that we there's some things that we really haven't got a lot of input into, and so that's almost like a humbling thing in a very grand way. And then I think the other thing is, and this again, this wasn't something that I welcomed, but what me and you would have been doing from March to May or maybe June was going up to Charlton a lot.
Yeah.
And suddenly we couldn't do that, and there was a whole lot of other things we couldn't do, and so we all had a lot more time in our hands, and at times that was pretty rough. And obviously it's going to be the same again for another 28 days or whatever. But some of that time, then you actually start to, and for me it was actually after the lockdown had ended really, but it was sort of noticing, well, you know, what does my life really mean? If I'm not going to Charlton, and I'm not, you know, going up to the office, and I'm not doing this, and I'm, you know, who am I really?
Yeah.
You know, where does my hope come from?
Yeah.
And you know, I don't think I can, you know, I need to say this in the strongest possible terms. I wish it hadn't had to have happened that way, because that would be to, you know, wish suffering, you know, which is nuts basically, and I don't believe that that's, you know, that's what's happening. You know, I don't think that God is deliberately causing us suffering. You know, but just going back to that Benning thing again, that, you know, the situation itself isn't a blessing, really isn't.
No.
But we might be able to find a blessing in it.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, there's obviously quite a common view amongst many people who follow Jesus, in a thing that for shorthand is called meticulous divine providence, and the basic thing there is, you know, you're always looking for the plan of God for your life, and where this all fits into God's great plan, and the plan is very individualistically seen, and not seen in a wider sort of, a lot of what the Bible says is about what the church will do, not about what you will do. And you do those things as part of the church. And one of the things that the Bible is all about is relational restoration and nurture. And one of the things that a society that doesn't take hold of the traditional Christian perspective may suffer from is relational deficit. On what basis do you relate to other people? What is the ground for your ethics?
I think this might be a good way to just go into our sort of last bit here, and I think we might have talked for a tad longer than we anticipated. I think we maybe planned for this to be 45 minutes, but it's been a good conversation. But just to sort of see how do we apply that to our lives, which I think is what you are about to start talking about, really. You know, what should, and I think, again, we're not sitting here saying this is the one answer, that this is the theology. We're saying this is a theology, and it's, to the best of our knowledge and understanding, this is what we think. You know, a sort of a Christian perspective should be. We're not claiming it's the only one, or, you know, the one true kind of.
I mean, I think from my point of view that eventually you have to get it down to, so what does this mean tomorrow? And so I think a lot of the time it means going back to this 1-12-70 thing, where you're doing things that seem doable. It's not, can I solve the mental health issues of the entire East Sussex area by forming a committee to do a project, to do this and this and this. It's, who could I ring? Is there somebody I could ring twice a week, or 2 people I could ring twice a week, just to make sure they're all right? Do talk to them about the coronavirus, but it's not all about that. It's about their everyday lives, you know.
I mean, some of it was, I can't remember exactly what individual it was. It might have been several people that, in sort of various things that I've been part of, that if we're not sort of explicitly Christian, had a Christian influence. And one of the things that, you know, I often heard was, do the next right thing.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes you don't know what you think, I just can't think about tonight or tomorrow, but what's the next right thing? And part of that is, as you say, kind of, if you can, looking outside yourself. And actually, one of the side effects of that is you might feel a bit better in yourself as well, by doing, you know, another thing that people said, for want of a better sort of phrase, is to have some kind of esteem, to feel all right about yourself, is, well, do some esteemable things. You know, and you're not doing it to kind of top yourself up, but a byproduct of it is, actually, that was really good, and it was really good. It helped that person, and you know what? It really helped me as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two dynamics there. One is we were created for goodness, and stuff happens inside our bodies, chemically, emotionally, whatever way, when we do something that brings pleasure or joy or relief or whatever to other people, and so it's kind of built into the engineering of ourselves, that when we do that, which is good and nurturing, and you know, following off of that creational thing, you then get into the commandments, and Jesus highlights love the Lord thy God, love thy neighbor as thyself. So we're not supposed to be going around hating ourselves. If we do hate ourselves, we often hate other people. We're supposed to love others in the same way that we would nurture ourselves and make sure that we'd eaten enough and that we were getting the basics. And so loving our neighbour as ourselves, you know, it could be the phone calls, but it could be that, can I get you your shopping? You know, does your garden need doing? I mean, not now, not in like mega lockdown, but those kind of things begin to restore. You know, one of the projects that I do with Ben's mum is an allotment project here in Eastbourne called the Gather Collective Community Allotment. And one of the things that happens is that people come along, they enjoy it, they enjoy sorting out the vegetables and digging and everything, but they really enjoy sitting at the table and eating the food that we cooked, that we pulled up a week or two before. And a lot of the joy comes from sitting in a relaxed atmosphere with friends, talking, laughing, and whatever. And so if we begin to think, how can we help people through the pandemic and beyond the pandemic? I had a friend locally, and he would dial somebody up on Zoom or WhatsApp or whatever, and he'd say, get some food on your table in half an hour, and then we'll have dinner together. So they would be eating at their end, they would be eating at their end, and then they'd chunder away to each other like they would have done if they were having a meal together.
Yeah.
And it's hundreds of little things like that that nurture something in somebody's emotional landscape. They kind of feel isolated, alone, broken, whatever it is, and then somebody gives them a bit of love and spends time with them. I spent time with a guy once, and he had quite major mental health issues and a particular condition. And he said to me, do you know what I like about talking to you, Dave? You don't talk to me about my condition, and you don't talk to me as if I had that condition. You just talk to me. He said, I really like that. And I think sometimes with people, we're like, oh, you know, I watched a program recently where this woman, different religious mindset to ours, but this lad came into their house and she was like, oh, I can help you sort out, you need maybe a bit of therapy there. And then he got up and walked away from the table. He didn't, sometimes people don't want us to help them sort out their problem. They just want us to be their mate. And being their mate helps sort out the problem to a degree. Not all of it, but it just creates the emotional groundwork where they can begin to feel better about life. And people are feeling really bad about life at the moment. And little things can help them feel better about life. And we should just be looking for the little kindnesses to each other, to our immediate circle. And then it's kind of, there's this idea that was captured in a book that I read about holiness, and people think, oh, holiness, scary word, oh dear. And actually has a negative connotation for many of us, because we feel it's like, oh, you've got to do this and this and this and tick that box, and if you haven't done that, you failed and God's going to be angry. Whereas holiness is doing that which is right, and it's often connected with justice. And then this guy says that when we do it consistently, it becomes contagious, that people are drawn towards it and want to emulate it. And so this is a time for contagious holiness. And I don't mean wandering the streets going, you know, You're being smitten by God, especially wandering the streets, doing good, blessing people, getting their shopping, dropping stuff off at their door, you know, all that kind of thing. That's what God wants. Contagious holiness.
Well, that seems like an appropriate place to sort of draw most of our conversation to an end, really. And I guess just to say that, yeah, you'll probably be watching this. Well, if you got this far, that we'll try and do this again, maybe in a week's time or something. And you know, as I said earlier, there might be bits of what we've talked about today that we might touch on in a bit more detail, and there might be other things, you know, that are just going on at the moment, going on today or going on next week, where we'll try and draw out some wisdom and some biblical sort of perspective on that. Just, I mean, if nothing else, for, well, you know, what should we be doing right now? So I think what it might be nice, or it might be good rather than nice to do now, and this, depending on who you are and who's watching and whatever, but you know, it might be good for us to, for one of us to pray, and just pray a really simple prayer, which is the Lord's Prayer, which is kind of something that's been given to us, and it you know, it's just like the very basics of what we should do, and you know, it's not the end of what we should do, but sometimes you don't know what else to pray, and the Lord's Prayer is right there, and it covers all of the sort of areas, in all of the things we need in our lives. So perhaps you want to just do that, and you know, I'm aware that there could be a few people watching this that it isn't familiar to, and they might think, oh, I'm just going to switch off now. They might think, well, I'm at least going to watch this bit, or actually, I really feel like, well, you know, what's the harm? I'm gonna pray this too. So take us away.
Our Father, which art in heaven, may your name be known as holy. May your kingdom come on earth. Just feel the import of that. May your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. I cry around the world at this time. Forgive us for our trespasses as we forgive others. Help us in the time of trial. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory. Amen. That is a beautifully subversive prayer from Jesus, which would take too long to explain just now, but we will come back to
another time.
A later discussion. Can I just mention two things to you as you're watching? There'll be an end screen in a few seconds now, which will tell you where you can subscribe to a YouTube version of this conversation.
Or on Facebook, or even on Twitch if you're younger than us, basically.
So we'll have all the details of the ways that you can be made aware when there's another one of these, including joining an email list. If you subscribe, you can unsubscribe at any time, and we won't share your information with anybody else. So if you found this helpful, then find a way to be reminded through what we'll put up on the screen at the end. And we'd love to just talk with you again. After a while, we may open up and say, guys, what kind of things would you like us to talk about? But in the short term, we've got a little editorial calendar, and we're going to slowly work our way through that.
I think we do have some ideas, but you know, there's always the scope for a sort of Q&A and somebody almost dialing in. I think if people are watching and you know, getting something out of this, then at least in the short term we plan to do this maybe until early April, and then we'll see how things are going from there. But thank you for sort of being with us today, and it's been really helpful for me, and I hope it's been helpful for you too. We'll see you next week.